the extended search into the nearby communities of Marlow and
Horror is often most powerful when it teaches us that fear begins long before the monster appears. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre understands this better than almost any film in the genre. Decades after its release, it remains disturbing not simply because of what it shows, but because of how it makes its audience feel trapped inside of a world that is unstable, incomprehensible, and already in motion. That lasting power makes the film a particularly interesting case for adaptation. What happens when that same dread is translated into a video game, or even a board game? This essay examines how suspense and dread are produced across the original 1974 film, the 2023 video game, and the board game adaptation, with particular attention to how each medium uses restricted knowledge, environmental hostility, and varying degrees of player or viewer control to create fear. Tobe Hooper's 1974 film is effective not because it presents horror as spectacle, but because it makes horror feel uncomfortably plausible. A huge part of this comes from the film's visual style. It has this rough, documentary-like quality that makes it feel less like a polished genre film and more like something observed in the wild. The lighting is harsh, the camera often feels unstable, and the whole thing has this sweaty, exhausted texture to it. It does not feel safe. It does not feel distant. It feels immediate. This is made possible in the way that the film effectively manipulates the environment to tell a story. The mise-en-scène feels dirty, heavy, and filled with dread. Its dark lighting, brilliant set design, and unpolished visuals all contribute to a baseline, unsettling feeling that foreshadows the violent events that would take place later in the film. Likewise, it becomes clear very quickly that the camera work and sound design are contributing to the suspense of the film. Sound is used in the way we assume for a horror film, preceding and intensifying moments of violence, but it is doing something more in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Sound lingers, taunts us, and prohibits us from ever feeling safe, the canonical hum of the chainsaw being the most recognizable. Likewise, the camera takes on almost a voyeuristic personality. It lurks in the background and is capturing fear and the eventual deaths of our main protagonists. Now, I want to transition to talking about some more ways the film builds suspense and ultimately horror. One of the most effective things about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is the way that it manages information. Suspense in horror often depends on a gap between what the audience knows and what the character knows. In this film, that gap is especially important because the characters are moving through a space they do not understand. The viewer can sense that something is wrong, but the film refuses to fully explain itself. That lack of explanation creates tension, and the world we are inhabiting feels hostile. One of the most impactful uses of this suspense-building tactic is in our gap in knowledge with the characters of the film when the real violence begins. We are watching as our main group of protagonists are picked off one by the psychotic family. We see these events taking place and are constantly shifting back and forth between scenes of the victims being murdered and the rest of the unknowing group. This creates a profound sense of dread in the viewer as the fates of the unknowing survivors become clear to us. Moving forward, one cannot talk about suspense and fear within this franchise without talking about the character design and the acting. Leatherface, the main antagonist of the film, has become a classic horror icon, and for good reason. He and the sick members of his family are not some far-fetched, supernatural antagonist, rather a plausible representation of violence pushed to its logical extreme. In fact, the film is said to be influenced by the very real and very disturbing serial killer Ed Gein, also known as the Butcher of Plainfield. Ed Gein was an infamous grave robber and serial killer from Wisconsin, a case so grisly that he inspired several horror icons, including Norman Bates from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, and Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, and of course, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. All of this is to say that the kind of horror that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre produces is one rooted not in cinematic spectacle, but a true violent reality. Leatherface produces dread and horror because he is framed not as a supernatural force or an unknowable monster, but as a violently plausible human being shaped by his family, his environment, and his need to kill. That plausibility is what makes him so disturbing. He does not need to belong to another world in order to feel unreal, because the film suggests that this kind of brutality can emerge from very ordinary human conditions. This film has been said to be a representation of America at large, pointing out our seemingly natural human inclination towards violence and chaos. On the note of suspense, Tobe Hooper, the film's director, was asked about the generation of suspense in his film at a screening of its restoration in 2015 at the Off-Screen Festival in Brussels. The interviewer states, "There's a lot of classic suspense in the movie," to which Tobe Hooper responds, "Yes, we did a lot of psychology and studying what it was that made genre films work. One of the things that always works, one of the creepiest things a horror film can have, is the ambiance of death. Like the way Frankenstein's monster is put together by pieces of dead bodies. That's why I open the film in a graveyard. You're immediately repelled by this stuff. Like the sight of a coffin. It's classic Freudian. Freud wrote that he would hold his breath whenever he passed a cemetery." He continues by saying, "A lot of people have phobias about death. I used to have them as a child because our family was rather large and there was always someone dying. They would always take me to the funeral parlor and everyone was looking towards the end of the room at this big box. So I asked why everyone was looking at the box, and all they told me was, 'You remember Aunt so-and-so? Well, she's in that box, asleep.' That was all the information I got, until one relative of mine told me that everyone dies and the world will end." From this, we can see that horror does not only come from the violent images themselves, it comes from the atmosphere around them, the realism, the twisted environment, and the broken sense of safety, and the fact that the audience understands just enough to be afraid, but not enough to feel prepared. This is the foundation that the later adaptations have to work with. Because once Texas Chainsaw Massacre becomes interactive, the question changes. Films can control perspective directly. A game may be limited in its ability to do that, but also comes with its own affordances. So, if the original film creates dread through cinematic control, then the adaptations have to create it through different systems. Here, we're going to shift our attention to the video game. The 2023 video game faces a very different challenge when thinking about generating suspense and recreating these emotions we feel when watching the film. The question that remains is whether or not a video game has the capability to reproduce these kinds of emotions, or if it's producing an entirely different kind of fear and emotion. As we have seen, a film can control what you see and when you see it. A game cannot fully do that because the player always has some degree of agency. Even when that agency is limited, it changes the structure of fear. You're not simply witnessing dread and horrific imagery, you're participating in it. So the game has to build tension through mechanics. This is where Ian Bagos's concept of procedural rhetoric becomes useful. In a game, meaning is not only communicated through the story or visuals, it's also communicated through rules. The game makes an argument through how it plays. If the mechanics make the player feel vulnerable or constrained and uncertain, then those feelings are not accidental, but they're part of the design of the game. So let's talk about the mechanics of this game and how it recreates the dreadful environment and narrative of the original film. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre video game is an asymmetrical survival horror game originally developed by Sumo Nottingham and published by Gun Interactive. The game's main mode features 4 victims attempting to escape a family of cannibals before they catch them and kill them. The game's cast stars Kane Hodder as Leatherface, who also plays the character as a stunt double in the 1990s Leatherface: The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, and Edwin Neal as the voice of the hitchhiker, reprising his role from the original film. The game takes place in 1973, nearly 5 months before the events of the original film. The narrative of the game revolves around Anna Flores and her friends who go searching for her missing sister in the town of Newt, Texas, where the events of the film takes place. The group is kidnapped by the family, which lays the groundwork for one round of this game. Essentially, at the start of the game, you choose whether you want to play as a member of the family or as a member of the group of victims. One round or match of this game consists of 4 victims trying to escape 3 family members. The matches are set on one of 6 possible maps, including the Slaughter family house, a gas station, a slaughterhouse, a mill, and Nancy's house, who is a member of the family, and lastly, a graveyard. Each map also has a day or night mode to choose from. The victims have to find their way out of the house through one of 4 escape points in order to win the game, all while the members of the Slaughter family are chasing them down and trying to kill them. Victims are given relatively weak abilities to defend themselves, while members of the family have various special abilities that allow for a more swift means of killing their prey. Family members must also feed Grandpa, a stationary character who feeds on the blood of the victims, and blood buckets around the map. After he is awoken by enough noise being made by victims, he will occasionally shriek, revealing the outlines of any victim who is moving to all the family members. And finally, a match is completed when all victims either escape or are killed. Now, the environment of this game matters immensely when thinking about suspense. Henry Jenkins' idea of environmental storytelling helps to explain how the game turns space into narrative. Henry Jenkins defines environmental storytelling as, quote, the deliberate use of physical spaces, architectural features, and visual design within a game world to stage a narrative, rather than relying solely on dialogue or cutscenes, end quote. We can extend this argument to say that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, much like the film, uses its intense spatiality as a means of generating horror and suspense. The map, which recreates the set of the murders in the original film, is not just a backdrop for the action, it foreshadows the imminent danger that faces the victims, enveloping them, and in turn the player into a horrifying hellscape of death and fear. Narrow passageways, obstructed sightlines, and escape routes that are difficult to reach, all of these things communicate threat before any member of the family even appears. What is especially effective here is that the game turns anticipation into pressure. You're constantly making decisions with incomplete information. You know you have to escape, but aren't sure which passage will be free of your attackers. You know you have to pick up materials, but you're not sure what you need to pick up, what you should take, and what you should leave. That uncertainty becomes the source of dread and ultimately creates most of the suspense in the game. And honestly, that's one of the most interesting differences between film and game horror. In a film, you may feel helpless because you can't intervene. In a game, you may feel helpless because you can intervene, but don't have all of the information or means to do so. You are always making decisions, and the game is always reminding you that those decisions may be bad. But the question remains as to whether or not this kind of suspense and horror is faithful to the original film, or if it's doing something entirely different. I want to talk about this specifically for instances where we are playing as the victims. This game is actually very enjoyable, especially when playing as members of the family. That being said, playing as the family doesn't necessarily give us a horrific experience. Sure, the atmosphere and uncertainty remains, but there's nothing at stake other than losing the match. In other words, there's no real threat of violence, death, or even being scared by the victims appearing, as we can see them through walls. The real horror from this game comes when we play as the victims. It is here where I think the game actually does a great job of mimicking the kinds of emotions elicited by the film. Rather than watching the events take place in front of us, we're placed in the very center of the horror. The game immerses us in an environment shaped by darkness, dirt, blood, and fear, and produces feelings very reminiscent to the original film. That being said, the game definitely loses some of the impact of the beautiful yet horrifying visuals of the original film. It's my stance that this happens because of the introduction of agency in the game. The film effectively utilizes the concept of the tyranny of film, subjecting us to horror by forcing our eyes to linger on the terrifying, realistic aesthetics and performances, whereas the introduction of player agency gives us more of a sense of control of the situation. While you can argue that the suspense of not knowing where certain characters are in the map recreates the same kind of horror, it doesn't have quite the same impact on how we feel during each of these experiences. When you're playing the game, you have a task, an objective. Your attention thus is taken somewhat away from the horrific imagery of your surroundings and put towards escaping or hiding from the family. Instead of being forced to sit with the horror and to absorb its atmosphere the way we do in the film, we're often thinking in terms of strategy, where to go, when to move, how to avoid detection, and how to complete the objective. This shift matters because it changes dread into something closer to problem solving. The film's terror lingers precisely because it gives us no escape from its imagery. The game, by contrast, asks us to act within the horror, which means our attention is divided between surviving and actually feeling afraid. Even when the game is tense, that situation is mediated by agency. We're no longer passive witnesses to violence and terror, but active participants in a system, and that interactivity makes the experience more dynamic, but also less overwhelming. In that sense, the game can approximate the film's sense of horror, but it cannot fully reproduce the same sustained sense of helplessness that makes the original film so unsettling. Now let's shift to talking about the board game. The board game adaptation presents a different kind of challenge because, unlike the film or the video game, even, it has to generate suspense almost entirely through tabletop mechanics. In the game, up to 4 players are stranded after their van runs out of gas and must work together to escape the Slaughter family. The premise is simple enough, but the game quickly reveals how much of its tension depends on managing systems rather than absorbing the atmosphere. My group played with 4 players, and even after a full session, the game remains somewhat difficult to grasp. It asked the players to keep track of a surprising amount of information at once, while also balancing movement across the board with token-based actions that can draw the family closer, cost us health, or create other setbacks. The group's main objective is to locate 3 gas tanks and a set of keys hidden among tokens on the board, all while navigating a map that becomes increasingly dangerous as we move through it. In that sense, the game creates suspense through constant pressure. Every movement increases the risk of encountering a family member. Every token drawn carries uncertainty, and we are forced to move through a board that is actively trying to kill us. What stood out to me most was that the game seems to split suspense into multiple channels rather than concentrating it in one place. Some of the tension comes from the family tracking board, as we watch the Slaughter family members become active and move closer to us over time. Some of it comes from the uncertainty of drawing tokens from the bag, since so many of them carry negative consequences. And some of it comes simply from watching the family figures inch closer and closer each round, which produces a steady buildup of pressure. At the same time, though, the game's combat mechanics significantly reduces the horror whenever an encounter actually happens. Instead of feeling terrifying, those moments become more procedural. We take damage, then move away based on how much damage we can absorb. It is functional, but not especially frightening. In that sense, the game borrows from the video game's logic of tracking danger over time, especially in the way that it monitors blood being brought to Grandpa. But it does not transform direct confrontation into horror in the same way that the film does. For my group, the game created tension, but not fear. No one at the table felt genuinely horrified, even if several mechanics did produce a sustained sense of suspense. Ultimately, this may be because board games cannot rely on the same immersive qualities as film or even video games. There's no soundtrack to manipulate emotion, no visual realism to unsettle the player, and no real sense of bodily danger. The game can simulate pressure, but it cannot fully reproduce the sensory intensity of horror cinema. In my experience, that absence of sound, atmosphere, and horrific imagery made it very difficult for the game to feel truly scary. Of course, it's silly to think that a board game could ever really recreate the emotions of a transformative film such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. However, I wouldn't call this game an absolute failure. While it might not faithfully make us feel the way a film can, it certainly does put an interesting twist on the mechanical embodiments of suspense and horror. If nothing else, this game provides an outlet for fans of the franchise to experience the iconic story in an entirely different way. That being said, the game essentially manipulates the story into a gamified narrative that allows for a new or different experience of the film. Ultimately, then, the board game does not recreate the horror of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre so much as it reconfigures it into something more procedural and strategic. It is less effective as a source of fear, but still interesting as an adaptation because it reveals how the franchise's suspense can survive even when its most immersive qualities are stripped away. Ultimately, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre environment and legacy endures its transition from film to video game to board game because its horror is not dependent on one specific medium so much as on a structure of uncertainty. The film creates dread through realism, sound, and horrific imagery. The video game translates that dread and fear into mechanics, movement, and a combination of procedural and environmental tension. And the board game reconfigures it into hidden information, resource management, and shared vulnerability among different players. But what becomes clear across all three is that each medium changes the emotional experience of the story in important ways. Some forms can immerse us more fully, some can make us active participants, and some can only approximate the feeling of fear through systems of play. And yet, even as the adaptations shift the horror into new forms, they preserve the central insight and legacy of the original film, that the most terrifying thing is not the violence itself, but the use of the environment to immerse us in unsettling and grotesque manifestations of fear, death, and chaos. In the end, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre shows us that horror isn't necessarily reproduced in the same way across different media, but that it has the possibility of translating itself using procedures, mechanics, and a manufactured pressure that provides us with a new lens to view the original film and the representation of horror across media generally.